Welcome, everybody. Oops, let's move that away. My name is Terry Swartz-Russell, and I am one of the team members of the Temple Emunah Anti-Semitism Initiative that has been working all year long, bringing different perspectives and different areas to learn about anti-Semitism to our community. Tonight, we're going to do a session on taking charge of the fight against anti-Semitism, exploring the IRA working definition of anti-Semitism with Rob Leikind. Hold on, got to let a few people in. Admit all, wonderful. I just want to just sort of put a little bit in context, although I think everybody knows that over the past few years, we've witnessed a number of violent anti-Semitic crimes in the United States, including murders in synagogues, at a kosher grocery store, at a Hanukkah party, and even a stabbing in our local community of the Chabad rabbi in Brighton. These incidents and others have generated a new public conversation about anti-Semitism, hopefully beyond the Jewish world. But the first step in confronting anti-Semitism is to understand it. So that's why we've been doing what we've been doing. And I want to thank all those people who are on the team, who shall remain nameless for right now so we can get going for tonight. But when you should know that Temple Emunah, under the guidance of Richard Hochman and Harvey Lowell, who are part of the team, brought a request to the Temple Emunah Board of Directors to adopt the working definition, the IRA working definition of anti-Semitism. We all understood when we went to the board meeting that none of us knew enough about it. So we did a little bit of a deep dive on our own, sending out articles, et cetera. And then when we decided we should do an evening of study, which we really wanted to be in person, but that didn't happen, I turned to Rob Leikind, who I know knows a lot about this. And so not only is Rob a key player in AJC's response to anti-Semitism, he's also a respected member of our local Jewish community and intimately familiar with anti-Semitism in other communities. I think his bio speaks for itself, but I would think he deserves an introduction, so he's going to get one. Rob's been the director of No, that's not enough. He's been the director of AJC New England since 2008. And during his tenure, he's worked with a passionate lay and professional team to build a vibrant AJC New England dedicated to advancing AJC's global program to fight anti-Semitism and other forms of hate, advance democratic values at home and abroad, right now dealing with Ukraine, and ensure a secure and peaceful future for the state of Israel. Rob's began his career working with Holocaust survivors. He's been a lawyer by training. He served as assistant district attorney before going to be the director of ADL's Connecticut and Boston offices. And he's been senior vice president of Hebrew College. So he's done a lot of wonderful things. And we're going to turn it over to Rob tonight. He's going to speak for about 25 minutes. And I'm going to take questions that you should write in the chat. And then we'll moderate them at the end, since there's a lot of us. So that's how we're going to handle it tonight. And that's where we're going to go. And I'm going to hand it over to Rob right now. So thank you, Rob. Take it away.
Terrific. Thank you, Terry. And hello, everyone. Thanks for making time to participate in this conversation today. Look, I want to talk about a subject that I think is of genuine importance, and hope that when I'm done, you'll think so too. First, however, I really do want to thank Richard Hochman and Harvey Lowell and Terry Swartz-Russell for raising this discussion and inviting me to share a few ideas. When I'm done, I'll be eager to hear some of your thoughts as well. Before we jump in, however, I need to say that when we first started discussing having this program, I don't think that any of us could have imagined the horrendous situation that's taking place in Ukraine. And as significant as I think the issues are about anti-Semitism today, in some ways it feels a little bit almost like a small bore issue, given the horrendous events that are taking place there. I was thinking about that a little bit. I think that part of what's at stake there also has to do with anti-Semitism. You know, people say that anti-Semitism is the canary in the mine, and democracy is what cleans toxicities out of deep minds, like anti-Semitism. And so the struggle there that's happening is not only a struggle for the freedom of people of Ukraine, but it also speaks to a fundamental concern. Jews have always done better in democratic environments where they have the wherewithal to fight back when needed to be. And so I want to be mindful of that as we begin to dive into some of the significant concerns that the Jewish community has today. Rabbi Angela Buchdaler, New York City's Central Synagogue, recently commented that if you're a Jew in America and you're not feeling unsettled, then you're not paying attention. Most of us, I am confident, are here tonight because we are paying attention. News about anti-Semitic events and related activities on attacks on Jewish legitimacy are surging, not only here, but across the country. A decade ago, when we talked about anti-Semitism, we looked at it as an ominous cloud on the horizon. Today, for many of us, if not most of us, it's an active threat. Sometimes I hear people speculate whether or not things are beginning to resemble the late 1930s. Now, candidly, I'm not smart enough to judge, but I do think it's helpful to remember that the American Jewish community is perhaps the most well-established and organized diaspora community in our long Jewish history. With all its failings, many of which are on full display today, we live in a democracy that affords us extraordinary opportunity to protect our interests. The issue for us is not whether anti-Semitism is rising. Regrettably, the waxing and waning of anti-Semitism is a permanent reality for Jews. The issue for Jews in America is whether we will seize upon the freedoms and resources available to us to secure our future. And in a real sense, that's what I want to talk about tonight by sharing with you 4 observations. The first observation is this: to fight anti-Semitism, people have to understand how to recognize it. Very simple concept. To fight anti-Semitism, people have to understand how to recognize it. American Jews are deeply concerned by the apparent spread of anti-Semitic ideas. We're seeing it in social media. We see it in pronouncements made by major public figures. We see it on college campuses, and we see it in the FBI's most recent hate crime report, which stated that in 2020, 57% of all religiously based hate crimes were directed against Jews, who constitute 2% of the American population. In Massachusetts, in 2019, that number rose to 70% of religiously based hate crimes. Many of us fear, with some reason, that we're returning to an old normal in which Jewish evildoings populate the imagination of many of our neighbors. This renewed sense of danger is prompting synagogues across our region and the country to lock their doors and hire security guards. According to AJC, let me share with you, if I can find it. Here. According to the AJC's most recent annual survey of anti-Semitism, 90% of American Jews now believe that anti-Semitism is a serious or somewhat serious problem. 82% believe anti-Semitism has increased in the last 5 years. 31% believe that the status of Jews is less secure than it was a year ago. 39%, nearly 40%, have changed their behavior, meaning changed the way they dress, changed places they go out of fear of anti-Semitism. And that's in the last 12 months. And nearly a quarter of American Jews polled have been targets of anti-Semitic incidents in the last year. This let me just stop this here for a moment. But these numbers point to a very basic problem that many of us haven't adequately appreciated. In a parallel survey that was done at the same time, AJC asked questions of the larger public, and we learned that 1/3 of Americans, think about this, 1/3 of Americans either don't know what anti-Semitism is or have never heard of the word. Among those who do know what anti-Semitism is, including many Jews, people are still not clear about what makes something anti-Semitic. Of course, we recognize anti-Semitism in blunt acts, a hostage taking at a synagogue, an attack on a rabbi walking on the street, someone hurling an insult to a Jew wearing a kippah. Those kinds of incidents we can understand. But beyond this are a vast array of actions that may evoke concerns about anti-Semitism, which are simply not obvious to people who have not grown up with it and are not attuned to anti-Semitism. For most people, even most Jews, recognizing anti-Semitism is modeled after the late Supreme Court Justice Potter Stewart's definition of anti-Semitism. He was adjudicating a case in which it was a First Amendment case in which it was going to be important for him to describe what is pornography, and he didn't want to do it. So he said, you know it when you see it. Now, this may be an adequate definition for pornography. It definitely is not sufficient when it comes to anti-Semitism. According to AJC's survey, most Americans think anti-Semitism is a bad thing. The problem is that when events are not blunt, people may not see anti-Semitism or even recognize when they themselves are saying or doing something that's anti-Semitic. Consider two recent examples that many of you have read about in the news. Every Jew, oh my goodness. Every Jew in America instantly suspected that the hostage taking at Congregation Beth Israel in Cooleyville, Texas, was motivated by anti-Jewish ideas. But the same was not obvious to the special agent in charge of the FBI, Dallas office of the FBI. He reported in a press conference immediately after the incident that there was no indication of an anti-Jewish motive to the attack on the synagogue. I don't think that was because of anti-Semitism or hostility towards Jews. He was reporting his observation because he wasn't attuned and aware of what might make something anti-Semitic. And what about Whoopi Goldberg, who argued that the murder of 6 million Jews could not be racist because it was white on white crime? She's not an enemy of the Jewish people by any means, but in the absence of a clear understanding of what anti-Semitism is, coming from our Jewish community, she borrowed from another popular framework that does not recognize anti-Semitism in the common understanding of racism. This kind of confusion undermines our capacity to take charge of the fight against anti-Semitism. If people don't recognize what is anti-Semitic, how can we fight it? And this brings me to my second observation. There's no better resource for helping people recognize what may be anti-Semitic than the IHRA working definition of anti-Semitism. Terry, I think there's some people waiting in the, I'm seeing on my screen. There's no better resource for helping people recognize what may be anti-Semitic than the IHRA working definition of anti-Semitism. As we all know, there are libraries full of books with definitions and explanations of anti-Semitism. So a reasonable starting point for this kind of conversation is manishtana. What makes this definition so different from others that have come before? And the answer is, it's no ordinary definition. It grew out of a meeting in the year 2000 in Stockholm, Sweden, that brought together 30 nations and several dozen world leaders who signed an historic agreement called the Stockholm Declaration. Through it, these nations pledged to work together to preserve the memory of the Shoah and also preserve the lessons that came from the Shoah. The vehicle for their commitment became an organization called the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance. Today, it has 34 nation members. In the years after the signing of the Stockholm Declaration, you may remember that there were lots of violent incidents, anti-Semitic attacks on Jews across Europe. Leaders in countries across the continent struggled to understand what was happening and quickly recognized a fundamental problem. People, even those in positions of leadership, didn't understand what made something anti-Semitic.
Rob, can I just stop you for a second? I gave you host permission and then I lost it. So if you give it back to me, I can let people in again. Sorry about that, guys.
You're really taxing me now.
Go to your participant thing and push on your own name, and then you'll see.
There, right.
I am sorry.
That's okay, Terry. I'm clicking on my name. It says more.
Okay, so click on mine and see if you can make me the host on the
Yes.
participant list. Okay, thank you very much. Okay,
Yeah, not a problem. Not a
okay,
problem.
great.
So there were anti-Semitic incidents were breaking out across Europe. Major leaders had no idea what to do because in the absence of a clear understanding, they also discovered there was limited data with which to study the phenomenon and develop constructive policies to deal with it. Judges, policymakers, educators, and activists needed a framework that could ground and shape the conversation on anti-Semitism. This problem brought together an array of European and American organizations like AJC, government agencies, and so on, to develop a common definition. And for more than a decade, advocates played with various models. In 2016, the IHRA, which is also known, by the way, affectionately as IRA, finally adopted the working definition of anti-Semitism. And then something extraordinary happened. Let me put up again a PowerPoint.
Okay, you should be good.
Okay, great. Maybe. Okay. In the space of 5 years, 33 countries endorsed the IRA definition of anti-Semitism. The Secretary Generals of the United Nations and the Organization of American States, the European Parliament. The Obama administration adopted an earlier version of the definition, and subsequently the Trump and the Biden administrations adopted the IRA definition. In addition, you have 5 New England governors, most recently Governor Baker 2 weeks ago. You have 3 former Massachusetts governors, Deval Patrick, Bill Weld, and Mike Dukakis. You have local community leaders like Lee Pelton, head of the Boston Foundation, and Steve Grossman, former head of the Democratic National Committee and AIPAC. Hundreds of international organizations, NGOs, states, municipalities, and religious organizations have also done that. But if you want to really see something extraordinary, let me take you to our next slide. Not only have all these non-Jewish public organizations and NGOs supported it, but within the major organizations in the Jewish community, there's been overwhelming support for the IRA definition. 51 of 53 members of the Conference of Presidents of Major Jewish Organizations have endorsed this, including nearly all of the major Jewish religious organizational umbrella groups, but also Jewish advocacy organizations from the left, right, and the center. You have AJC and ADL, you have Hadassah, Hayas, Hillel International, the Jewish Labor Committee, National Council of Jewish Women's, and on and on. So you have a document where everybody has seen, there's a consensus building around this. And what this means, I think this is one of the central points here, is that for what may be the first time in Jewish history, we may be on the cusp of a common framework for understanding and explaining and responding to Jew hatred. You simply can't overstate how valuable a contribution this could be to the fight against modern anti-Semitism. You simply can't fight what you don't understand, what you can't recognize, and you can't see. And this brings me to my third observation. The IRA definitions, let me stop the share here. The IRA definition's great appeal reflects the great need it addresses and also the judicious way it does it. The working definition starts with a basic proposal. It's an educational tool that is not intended to be legally binding. We don't think it should be codified. It doesn't define or label who or what is anti-Semitic. Instead, it provides guideposts to help people recognize acts that may be anti-Semitic. To understand how this works, let's take a look at the definition quickly here. The definition itself is about as parv as you can get. It says anti-Semitism is a certain perception of Jews which may be expressed as hatred towards Jews. Rhetorical and physical manifestations of anti-Semitism are directed toward Jewish or non-Jewish individuals and or property, toward Jewish community institutions and religious facilities. That's the definition. But it really is just an umbrella for the central part of it. The definition is explained not by detailed explanations, but by giving 11 examples of what could be anti-Semitic. Let's take a look at that for a second. These are some of the samples that could be anti-Semitic. Accusing Jews or Israel of inventing or exaggerating the Holocaust could be anti-Semitic. Accusing Jewish citizens of being more loyal to Israel, the Jewish priorities, than the interests of their own nations. Demonizing Jews in the collective for controlling the media, the economy, and the government. Denying the genocide of the Jewish people in World War II. All of those things, the definition says, could be anti-Semitic. Let me close this for a second. But it's important to understand the role of these examples in the definition. They don't dictate whether any given action or opinion or idea is anti-Semitic. Instead, they identify certain kinds of activity that could be symptomatic of anti-Semitism. And then they say, if you encounter such an activity, you can't assume that it's anti-Semitic. You need to examine the context of that situation before making a judgment. You can best understand how this working definition works by thinking about WebMD. Let's say you hurt a toe on one of your feet, and you go to WebMD and it says painful toe. And you look it up, and in WebMD, it says, well, you have a painful toe. That could be a symptom of a broken bone. It could be a symptom of a pulled muscle. It could be a symptom of a sprain. It could be a symptom of gout. Now, it doesn't say that you have gout. It says that you have a symptom of gout. And now you have to go research and take medical tests and so on and find out whether in fact that's actually the case. The IHRA working definition of anti-Semitism very much works on that principle. Someone asked me, if the working definition is supposed to define anti-Semitism, why is it only focus on symptoms? The reason is that anti-Semitism, like medicine, is complex. There's no single algorithm which could be applied to all circumstances and help us determine whether they're anti-Semitic. So the working definition has created a simple framework, one that is accessible to judges and policymakers, but also the person on the street, to help us recognize and understand what could be anti-Semitic. Let me offer you an example of how this could work. A small group of students at a small New England college wanted to launch a progressive Zionist club. When they applied to the student government for club status, they were denied. In 10 years, no student group had been denied. The reasons given was that since the Jewish students represented that their club was progressive, it needed to be more diverse. And the student government recommended that the Jewish students reapply, but this time with a Palestinian co-chair for the club. The Jewish students noted that only a few weeks before, the student government had authorized club status for the virulently anti-Israel Students for Justice in Palestine club. Not accepting their application was anti-Semitic. The student government, of course, denied this, and that view was supported by the college administration. Now, many of us, if you hear a fact pattern like this, might immediately suspect that this is a situation where blatant anti-Semitism was on display. The working definition, however, doesn't say this. What it does is provide a framework for recognizing what may be anti-Semitic. So had the IHRA working definition already been adopted at the college, the members of the student government and the administration would have been on notice from the get-go that their action might be problematic because it resembled one of the identified symptoms. If, however, the student government persisted in denying the progressive Zionists their club, there would have been a framework that the Jewish students could have turned to that would have legitimized their concerns and compelled a conversation about anti-Semitism. It did not happen in this instance. In other words, the definition creates a level of accountability that doesn't exist today and compels parties to consider concerns about anti-Semitism. This kind of accountability would alter the landscape in a constructive way by compelling a discourse on anti-Semitism that is being voided today in many, many situations. And this brings me to my fourth observation. To fight anti-Semitism, we need a common language for describing it that enables us to recognize it. This common language will only take root if local Jewish communities are committed to it. As I mentioned before, because of the extraordinary global support that the IHRA working definition has already received, we have a unique historic opportunity to finally establish a common language for recognizing and addressing anti-Semitism. Without it, we're hobbled in the fight against anti-Semitism because people don't agree about what anti-Semitism looks like. The working definition removes this problem and provides us with the opportunity to reframe the discourse and take charge of the fight against anti-Jewish activism by encouraging municipalities, college administrations, DEI programs, schools, police departments, and more to adopt the working definition themselves. But these groups are unlikely to integrate the working definition into their operations unless they see that it's important to the local Jewish communities. If municipal leaders, for example, don't see interest from their Jewish citizens, why should they invest in this? This is why we at AJC have become so committed to advancing discussions like the one we're having tonight. With this in mind, I want to take a few minutes to share with you three common questions that have been raised about the IHRA working definition. The first question is this: because the definition identifies several types of criticism of Israel in its examples, could its use result in unfair demonization of those who have legitimate criticisms of Israel? I think if it did this, I would be very concerned too. But I think this concern is misplaced. Rather than suppress conversations, the working definition facilitates them. The definition is explicit in saying that criticism of Israel that could be applied to any other country is simply not anti-Semitic. More importantly, as I said earlier, the definition does not declare that anything is per se anti-Semitic. It only provides guideposts that point to some of the more common ways that anti-Semitism manifests itself, and then says, study the context to understand if the situation crosses some red line. In a nutshell, it's a framework for stimulating conversation, not suppressing it. A second concern that's raised, well, before I get there, let me offer an example to illustrate this point. One of the working definition's 11 examples refers to the act of, quote, denying the Jewish people their right to self-determination by claiming that the state of Israel is a racist endeavor. Now, many of us here and others might think that someone who denies Israel's right to self-determination is by definition anti-Semitic. But the IHRA definition doesn't say that. It says that such claims have sometimes been associated with anti-Semitic activities, and then goes on to say, if you think that's what's happening now, then you have the obligation to study and evaluate the circumstances and see if there's evidence to substantiate your concern. In other words, the IHRA definition does no more than say what could be anti-Semitic, and then ask people to evaluate the circumstances. But what this means is the IHRA definition provides us with tools to recognize anti-Semitism and discourages unsubstantiated accusations, while also encouraging conversation. And this brings me to a second question that's been raised. Does the definition risk chilling free speech? This claim misrepresents the working definition and its purpose. The working definition is just an educational resource. Our right of free speech is protected by our Constitution, and the working definition has no power to constrain speech of any kind. What the definition does do, as I've said before, is encourage speech. This time, it's encouraging speech about anti-Semitism. The third question is that there are other definitions, so why focus on this one? And it's a fair question. There are many other definitions, but two in particular, the Nexus and Jerusalem definitions, have drawn a lot of attention. Both were drafted by academic groups to protect critics of Israel against feared accusations of their being anti-Semitic. In fact, these definitions, in most respects, are consistent with the IHRA working definition, though far more prescriptive and detailed. But there are other important differences. The working definition was written to be used by judges and policymakers, but also parents and the guy on the street. To make it accessible, it relies on examples rather than detailed definitions created by academics for policymakers. The difference is compelling. The IHRA definition has not only been road tested by policymakers, judges, and educators, it's become widely used and now enjoys extraordinary support and legitimacy around the world, as I described. This support, again, means we have the opportunity to build a consensus on how to recognize anti-Semitism. That would be a game changer. None of these other definitions have come close to the extraordinary interest created by the IHRA working definition. Over the last several months, we've been holding meetings with municipal leaders of major New England cities to discuss with them concerns about anti-Semitism. They've been remarkably attentive and interested. But one question looms over all these discussions. What do members of the local Jewish community want? I'm hoping that with time, we'll be able to answer that question. Over the last 2 months, 4 synagogues have voted to endorse the IHRA working definition of anti-Semitism, most recently Temple Emmanuel of Newton 2 weeks ago. Others are now in discussions to do so. Our hope is that over the next year, many more will join so that we can begin to establish a normative framework that allows Jews to drive a conversation on anti-Semitism rather than have others do it for us. The extraordinary support that the IHRA definition has received creates a unique, arguably historic opportunity. But if we want to integrate this definition of anti-Semitism into the common understanding of anti-Semitism, then it will be essential for the local Jewish communities to also do that and let neighbors know why this is important to them. Doing so is a powerful way for all of us to enter the fight against anti-Semitism and help others join with us. It's also a way to build a more secure future for your children and grandchildren. This is an educational resource source that can serve as a platform for constructive discourse about anti-Semitism and Israel in your synagogue community. And that will make it possible for synagogue members, committees, and leadership to become activists against anti-Semitism in your own community by introducing the working definition to local educators, law enforcement, human rights councils, so on, and encouraging them to use it when issues arise. Most decisions that will influence our futures happen in rooms that we never get to enter. But every now and then, history knocks on our door, and we have the opportunity to contribute tangibly to changes that can make a significant difference in our future. The IHRA working definition of anti-Semitism is a tool that will allow us to do that. This is an opportunity for us to take charge of the discussion on anti-Semitism and create accountability, but it won't happen without the support of our Jewish communities. I'm hoping that we'll all seize this opportunity. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Rob. That was very helpful to me anyway. While I have asked people to write some questions in the chat, so if you have any, please do so while I am asking Rob one question to begin. But I have to tell you that you really answered most of my questions. But we did talk earlier, and you said that there were 4 synagogues, one of which was 2 of which were in Sharon and 1 in Newton, et cetera. I'm wondering how, so the synagogues adopt it. Do they then have a connection to their town? Like, do we now go, if, let's say, Temple Muna agrees to do this, and Temple Isaiah agrees to adopt this definition, do we then go to the town of Lexington and ask them to adopt this working definition? Has that happened with, other synagogues in their towns? Have they tried? Is that a step that's worthwhile?
So, look, I think ultimately that would be our hope. But it's something that we would look to, and AJC would provide training and support for those kinds of efforts. One of the things that we've learned in the process of engaging in discussions with synagogues is that every synagogue is different. They have different ways of making decisions. They have different ways of organizing to do things. They have different understandings about priorities. And so we're very respectful of that. We think that, however, for those synagogues that want to be activists, this is a constructive way of engaging people and walking out and going to the Human Rights Commission as an example and saying, this is what our synagogue community thinks about the subject of anti-Semitism. This is how we understand it. We'd really like to talk to you about it, and we hope that maybe this can be helpful in your role and use it. And the opportunity is to build relationships, to begin discussions. They may not understand it or feel comfortable with it the first time, but every time an opportunity comes up, these are conversations that develop over time. What we have to understand is that anti-Semitism, to the extent it exists and people don't understand it, it's a process of educating people. But if I do it, or members of Temple Muna do it, totally different things.
Okay.
I'm a professional from a national, international organization, as opposed to people from the community who are voters, who are neighbors, who are people that you meet in the supermarket. It's a very different kind of discussion. I would welcome the opportunity to come back one day and talk about how you think about this process and organize it.
Okay, thank you, because I'm not sure what the next steps are, but we'll figure them out as we go along. Okay, there is a question in the chat, so let me go pull it out.
I see a couple.
Yeah, so let's go back to the beginning one. Is support of BDS anti-Semitic within this definition?
It's a great question. Thank you, whoever asked it. The answer is that the definition doesn't say that anything is inherently anti-Semitic. What it says is that there are symptoms that could be anti-Semitic, and one of them is denying the legitimacy of a Jewish state, could be anti-Semitic. It then goes and sort of says, okay, now explain why you think that is anti-Semitic and look at all the circumstances. So someone could say, look, I'm a believer in boycotts. I've advocated for boycotts in many other situations. I'm concerned about what's happening with the Palestinians, and I think this is a reasonable thing to do. I'm not for the destruction of Israel, but I think limited boycotts could be helpful. That's different from somebody who is saying that BDS, I personally, I may have my own beliefs about whether that person is anti-Semitic or not, but the definition doesn't say that. What it does is it compels a conversation and creates accountability for when it might be. So someone who says, look, I'm for BDS, and frankly, Palestinians are entitled to all their land and the Jews should go, that puts a different frame on it.
Right. So I'll get back to Sharon in a minute, but Benjamin asked, when I read the IRA definition, I actually thought of Justice Potter's dictum in terms of how vague and unhelpful it is. What does this definition itself add to the illustrations?
Not 100% sure I understand the question. Please.
Feel free.
Your question, what?
Yep, you can unmute yourself and explain.
Oh, sure. I mean, basically, when I look at the definition, it says anti-Semitism is a certain perception of Jews. I mean, that's the core of it as it's written. So I have trouble seeing how, without having a definition itself, give any real guidance as to it.
No, and so Benjamin, I think that definition is about it. That piece of the definition is about as parved as it gets, but you have to read on. And if you go down, there's a little bit more dicta, and then it goes into 11 examples. And those 11 examples are really the framing of the definition itself. Those examples are examples of things that are typically are commonly associated with anti-Semitic activity, words, so on and so forth. And so that umbrella language, I agree with you, looks like it was created by a committee. It was.
Yeah, so Mark picked up on that as well. He said, if the IRA definition merely provides the basis for discussing whether a particular action or incident is anti-Semitic, then how is it really a definition of anti-Semitism? And if a particular event looks like one of the examples, but none of them is definitively anti-Semitic, then what criteria are being employed beyond the definition?
That's a great question. Look, the anti-Semitism is a civilizational issue. It's vastly, vastly complex. At a certain point, when something is anti-Semitic is a political question, right? You're never going to get away from that. What it does, though, it grounds the conversation on anti-Semitism in ways that it has not been grounded before. Right now, we are operating under the Potter-Stewart rules. Anti-Semitism, you know it when you see it. There is no fundamental agreed upon framework. What we have here is a framework, a set of ideas that orient circumstances that could be anti-Semitic, and extraordinarily, it has international consensus. We can sit down and write scholarly, detailed explanations about the parameters of what anti-Semitism is in infinite numbers of situations. But at the end of the day, no one's going to read them. What you have here is something that was deliberately constructed as examples instead of narrative explanations, so that it would be accessible, it would be useful. And the proof is in the results. We are looking at a circumstance that the Jewish world has simply, to my knowledge, never seen before, where all of a sudden there is a language, and that language is not dogmatic. It doesn't condemn people for their beliefs, but it suggests that in the lived experience of Jews, here are 11 circumstances that are commonly identified with situations that in some instances do become anti-Semitic. If you look at what happened in the UK with the Labour Party. The Labour Party, there were a lot of people who were critical of Israel. And the defense, of course, was, we're not anti-Semitic, we're just critical of Israel. What happened, however, though, was it became evident at certain points that Israel was being held to a standard that other people weren't, other countries weren't being held to. It also became evident that some of the speakers, the promoters of the anti-Israel activism, had some very nasty things to say about Jewish people and about their power and control of life in the UK, and on and on. And so those become contextual facts that over time began to change the understanding of what was going on in the Labour Party. That's how you use this. If you're looking for a magic wand that says this is anti-Semitic and this isn't anti-Semitic, this definition won't do it. If you're looking at creating a political process through which Jews and others can begin to look at behaviors and actions and recognize places which may be anti-Semitic, that's what this will do. And given the circumstances we're in, we have no other tool that comes close to this.
I know that synagogues tend to shy away from politics, but it's being thrust at us. So I don't think that there's a choice. And somebody's got to lead this fight. So yes, I want to get back to Sharon's question about, you know, I mentioned that, do we bring this to the town of Lexington? Do we bring it to other, Sharon asked, do we bring it to other interfaith communities? And I really think, and the people on our team, our Anti-Semitism Initiative team have felt that after a year of study and learning, it's really our turn to branch out and to meet with others, not necessarily to talk about the definition of anti-Semitism, but just to meet with each other face to face and say, you know, you might not have met a Jew before, and I've not met somebody from your community. Let's sit down and chat, you know. And I think that get it, just like the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, just like, I don't know, there's so many blacks and whites, etc. You know, unless we start meeting each other as humans and face to face, it's not going to work, you know. And that leads us to Susan Cook's question, which is, could this IRA definition apply to other kinds of hate? She said, substitute Asian hate for anti-Semitism. What do you think, Rob?
I think that the examples that were given, probably not. It doesn't mean that there couldn't be an Asian American version of this. But the examples that are given are particular to the Jewish experience, or most of them are particular to Jewish experience. I think it would be up to people in the Asian American community to begin to formulate. I think the model could be used. And I would encourage it. I think this creates an opportunity for people to represent their concerns in tangible ways that it would help me understand the anxieties of the Asian community in a much more granular way than I'm able to do right now.
Okay. And Stan Wolf's asking, are there any case studies of settings wherein supposed anti-Semitic event have been discussed and policies adopted based on the discussions?
So the answer is yes. The IRA definition has been in use in Europe for years. It's informed judges, it's informed policymaking in many countries. It is a common practice. You know, the wave of anti-Semitism here in the United States runs 10 to 15 years behind what's going on in Europe. They've been marinating in difficult issues much longer and more intensely than we have until in the last several years. We've now received a lot of top-level support for this. I think that let me give you an example. We're just beginning the process on the local levels here in the United States, but let me give you an example from a situation that I've dealt with recently. Major corporation has a new DEI program, diversity, equity, and inclusion. The DEI programs are understandably focused on minority communities, increasing the integration of minority communities into their workforce, less focused on Jews. This company has a fair number of Jewish employees, and all of a sudden there were a series of very high-profile anti-Semitic incidents. And the Jewish employees noticed that the company was silent, whereas when there were anti-Asian events and anti-Black events, the company had lots to say. Programs started, statements came out from the CEO, and so on and so forth. At the behest of some of the employees, we met with the director of DEI, and I have no idea if she was anti-Jewish, but she had no concept that Jews had any issues or that anti-Semitism was even a serious concern because Jews are privileged. So why would it be a problem? that led to several conversations, discussion about training for this company, resources being put in place. And we're beginning to see, and the IRA definition was presented, so that people begin to understand what anti-Semitism looks like, to a degree that I don't think many of us in the Jewish community understand. People aren't thinking about anti-Semitism. They don't know what it is. They even wonder why it could possibly be an issue in many cases, because Jews are considered successful. So what's the issue? That connection, there's a lacuna here, which is basically the absence of a clear presentation of what our concerns are. A clear, broadly accepted presentation. If we don't provide that, people aren't going to know. It's that basic. Where there could be other definitions, there could be better definitions, but this is the one that has an international consensus, and it's proven effective.
Okay, thank you. Judy Cates wants to know, is Israel signed on to the IRA? Oh, I'm sorry, did you finish? Did I shut you off?
Me?
Yeah.
No.
You're ready
I'm
for
all
next
set.
question. Okay.
Yeah,
Is
absolutely.
Has Israel signed on to the IRA form or the Jerusalem Declaration or other definitions? What's happening in Israel with this?
Wow, I don't know.
Okay.
I have to imagine that Israel is one of the 34 signers on it. It has to be. I mean, I could look it up in a second, but can someone Google it?
Okay, we'll leave that for someone else. Judy, get to Googling. I don't know if Tom wrote this or Alan wrote this, but anti-Semitism is not for the Jews to fight alone. Our synagogue members of GBIO encouraging the non-Jewish member orgs to adopt this definition. Is the GBIO addressing this issue in any specific way? Now, you're not a GBIO person, but maybe you know.
I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't believe that this has actually been presented to GBIO at this point.
Yeah.
I mean,
I don't.
What's more important than going to GBIO is talking with the Jewish community. There's something a little bit off balance if we're going to Christian groups and asking them to adopt it, and our own local Jewish communities haven't done it, right? So we have gone to major political figures who were very happy to support us. But we understand that the stickiness, the traction will come from a retail interest from members of the local Jewish community.
Okay, we have a lot to do in our own communities first.
We do.
Okay, Mark is back with a question about evangelical Christians support Israel because they believe that when all the Jews are gathered in Israel, it will bring about the second coming of Jesus and the mass conversion of the Jewish people. How is that not considered a form of anti-Semitism?
I think that those ideas are.
Who's ever not on, please mute yourself because we're getting a lot of background music. So, thank you. Go ahead.
I think those ideas are rooted in views of Jews and Judaism that are doubt the legitimacy of our beliefs, of our way of life. It certainly isn't friendly to Jews. The IRA definition would look at that and would provide a framework for thinking about how people view us. I think I've spent some time with people in the evangelical community. I think that there are people who are very receptive to the Jewish world. There are people who are less so. The IRA definition doesn't take a position on evangelical beliefs. Again, it provides a framework for understanding, considering when things may be anti-Semitic. I think there's a legitimate basis for questioning whether or not some of those beliefs are anti-Semitic.
Okay. If you have a question, please put it in the chat. I'm just going to take one of the questions that's on already here. Martin Brower said, might the language of the JDA, anti-Semitism is discrimination, prejudice, hostility, or violence against Jews as Jews or Jewish institutions as Jewish, be a better statement, even if the rest of the IRA structure and spirit remains intact? I mean, you go.
So listen, I've spent my career in the Jewish world, and I've never written or seen anything that a group of Jews didn't say could be written better. and I'm not saying that, it's just that's how we're thinking about editing it. And I agree with the that I think that there could be better with Martin. I agree with Martin. I think this could be better written. That said, if everybody manufactures their own definition, then we won't have a consensus document anymore. So I understand the urge to look at this and edit it and make it better. I think there are ways that it could be made better too. It's not a perfect definition, but it is a product of years of effort to come up with a formula, and it has been successful. So while I totally understand the temptation to make this crisper, there's a real downside to doing that.
Thank you. So Judy getting back to the, did Israel sign on to this? And she said she did look it up before asking, and her list did not have Israel listed as one of the sponsoring,
Judy, if you go to the IHRA website, they have a list of all the countries that have endorsed it. And it should be up to date. And you can confirm it there.
Okay. And I think this is the last question, unless one more comes up. Bonnie is commenting about your comment about DEI. She says, it gives me more hope that our new DEI director in Belmont schools had already looked into a few anti-Semitic incidents in the fall and didn't write off the idea of including it in her role in the schools. She didn't even seem surprised by the question. And we, the LWV, which I don't know what that is, of Belmont, had a discussion with her last Friday. So, Lexi, I think that's great to hear. That's
great news.
League of Women Voters.
That's what I thought, but I just didn't want to overstep. Thank you, Mike. All right. Okay, here's Gideon. Gideon Ben Chorin says, in a soundbite, #GotchaWorld, is the IRA definition anything other than another clever Jewish ploy, Talmudic in its interpretation and application, to stem the tide of the historically successful use and propagation of the anti-Semitic mantra?
Wow.
Whoa.
Gideon, if you want to unmute and sort of explain a little, that would be good. Hello. Okay,
Yes.
Rob.
Hi.
Oh, here you are. I see you.
I wanted to poke the bear a bit.
Go ahead.
Gideon,
Poke
say
away.
more.
But it's a very serious question. And I understand its application in a lot of legal settings, a lot of university settings, government settings, and that's been great. And there's a recognition that results from that. But there's something that underlies all of this, and which we don't confront, and we just aid and abet. And Jewish organizations, particularly synagogues, also individuals, aid and abet this in a nonstop fashion. Whether it's JVP, it's just mind-boggling to me that there's no recognition within these groups that their very existence is a challenge to the existence of the Jewish people and its future.
Thank you.
But again, back to my main question, it's IRA is is wonderful in its conception, but the world we live in that doesn't operate that way. And the idea of educating people to, school programs, whatever, we've seen that. We've attempted that in measures that's successful. But there's something larger at work. And we're seeing it today with Putin, Ukraine. You just change the information that's given or withheld. Education doesn't play into that. That's a power dynamic. But anyway, let me let you.
So Gideon, I really appreciate what you're saying, and I actually agree with you. I think that the problem we face, and I kind of alluded to at the beginning of my remarks, is that anti-Semitism is a conspiracy theory. It's a conspiracy theory that has deep, deep historical roots. And unlike other forms of American prejudice, it's not based upon the idea that Jews are weak or somehow less than. It's based on the opposite idea, that Jews are powerful and corrupting. I sometimes like to reference, when Shakespeare wrote The Merchant of Venice in the very end of the 16th century, there hadn't been a Jewish community in the British Isles for 300 years. And yet he was writing for an audience that recognized Shylock, the Jew. They recognized him, they knew who he was, they knew what the attributes were, because the ideas of Jews as a kind of demonic presence is something that became embedded in the Western notion of Jewishness. Jewishness itself became identified with this carnal, aspiritual, corrupting force in society. And so that's one of the reasons anti-Semitism is so persistent, because that idea is deeply embedded in the Western mind. So when you say, Gideon, that there's something bigger going on here, I absolutely agree with you. Where I may not entirely agree with you is this. The IHRA is about education, but it's about something much more fundamental. It's about mobilizing Jews. It's about mobilizing Jews and having Jews take charge of the fight against anti-Semitism on local levels. In the small spaces where anti-Semitism appears, the discussions that need to happen, not because people necessarily hate Jews, but because they don't understand what we see. They don't see what we see. It's not their fault. It's our fault if we don't go out and educate people. The IHRA definition is a tool. It provides us tangible, easily decipherable, simple resources that any of us can take and walk into a teacher's room and say, this is something, this frames my thinking about some of these things. We want you to know about it. Better if you said, my synagogue looked at this and feels that this is something important, we're going to take it. But this can't be the kind of thing that's left to the experts. Experts can't do this. This is Jews being mobilized to go out into the community and talk about and educate. And I think that's the opportunity here, not because it's not going to change the fundamental reality you're pointing to, the disposition of so many people to look at Israel as the worst place in the world. I think many of those people don't hate Israel, but the fact that people are drawn to seeing Israel as the worst place in the world, not China and not a dozen other countries, is indicative of a fundamental reality. It's the Shylock syndrome. But we can't solve that part of it. What we can do is deal with the things in our community. The IHRA definition helps us do that.
Thank you, Rob. I think that's a good place to stop. I will stop with a comment from Marilyn Tracy. Thank you, Marilyn, that James Carroll in a lecture said that anti-Semitism is a 2,200-year-old problem. It's not going away, and it keeps morphing, and we have to, each of us has to take on a role to, in my opinion, to fight it and to help others understand and to us to understand it better. So I want to thank Rob for speaking to us and teaching us, and hopefully we can move this forward in our own community. But before you leave, please note that a couple of things are coming up within Temple Amuna in the next couple of weeks. Next week on March 24th, we have two amazing speakers. We are we invited Jeff Jacoby from the Boston Globe, who is one side of the political spectrum, and he invited a woman, Laura Adkins, who's an opinion editor at The Forward, who are going to Zoom in together and have a conversation, and they come from different perspectives, and I think it can be very fascinating. So I invite you to participate. The information about that and signing up for that came out recently. It's on the website. It'll be in the newsletter. And of course, we're finishing our year of study with our Glatzer weekend, which is April 1st to 3rd, our annual Scholar in Residence weekend with Dr. Rachel Fish, who is an expert in the area, unfortunately, of anti-Semitism, also in Israel. And she will be with us the whole weekend. And you've seen the topics that she's really covering a very broad spectrum. It should be fascinating. So you don't have to come and eat, but you can come and hear her. And if you're not ready to come in the building, all the lectures, we're all going to move to a place where we can live stream her talk. So they'll all be recorded, so people will be able to hear her whenever it and however it best meets your needs. But I'll give my big push that I gave at the beginning before we really started the program is I'd love to see everybody in person. It's safe. You can wear a mask. You don't have to wear a mask, etc. But I hope you'll be with us in some way, shape, or form. And I want to thank everybody for being here tonight, especially Rob Leikind. And we learned a lot. And hopefully we'll call on you again. Don't worry about it. Thank you very much.
Really been my
for
pleasure.
Being with us. Okay.
Yeah, Moon is an amazing community. It was really my pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, Lila Toval. Okay, take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.